Every few years, somebody tries to put Michael Jackson's life on screen, and every single time it fails to actually capture him. Not because the filmmakers weren't talented, and not because the story wasn't dramatic enough. It's because Michael Jackson was never just one person to tell a story about. He was a child star, a musical genius, a global phenomenon, a tabloid obsession, an accused criminal, a tragic recluse, a nostalgia icon. And now, more than 16 years after his death, he's become something else again. A pop culture event for a generation that never watched him perform live. Here's what's genuinely fascinating, though. Every time Hollywood has tried to tell Michael Jackson's story, the resulting film has ended up revealing just as much about the era that made it as it does about Michael Jackson himself. A family-approved nostalgia piece in 1992, a scandal-driven collapse story in 2004, timed right before his criminal trial, a sympathetic portrait of isolation in 2017, built entirely around his final, hidden years. And now, in 2026, a billion-dollar estate-backed spectacle designed to reintroduce him to a generation that discovered him through 15-second clips. 4 completely different versions of the same man. Some tried to protect his image. Others tried to profit off his downfall. Some were shaped directly by the Jackson family. Others were made entirely without their blessing, or their forgiveness. And what all 4 have in common is this: none of them were really just biography. Each one was an act of image-making, built for a specific moment, aimed at a specific audience, serving a specific agenda. So in this video, we're breaking down every major Michael Jackson biopic ever made. Not just how accurate each one was, but who was actually controlling the story behind the camera, and what that says about how Michael Jackson's public image has been rewritten again and again for more than 3 decades. The first serious attempt to dramatize Michael Jackson's life arrived in November 1992, with a 5-hour ABC miniseries called The Jacksons, An American Dream, broadcast across 2 nights. The series traced the family's entire arc: Catherine and Joseph Jackson's early relationship, the kids growing up in a cramped house in Gary, Indiana, the explosive rise of the Jackson 5, the Motown years, the jump to Epic Records, Michael's emergence as a global solo star, the infamous Pepsi commercial accident, the Motown 25 performance that introduced the world to the moonwalk, and finally, the family's reunion for the Victory Tour. What made this project genuinely different from anything that came before it wasn't the production value, it was who was actually behind it. The miniseries was based largely on Catherine Jackson's own autobiography, My Family. Jermaine Jackson served as one of the producers. And Motown executive Suzanne DePass, someone who had been genuinely present for the Jackson 5's rise during their Motown years, was deeply involved in shaping the production, giving the whole project a level of insider credibility that no outside filmmaker could have faked. For essentially the first time on this scale, the Jackson family wasn't reacting to somebody else's version of their story. They were writing it themselves. Michael Jackson wasn't formally credited as a producer or writer, but he was involved behind the scenes in ways that mattered. He reportedly signed off on casting decisions and on how certain key moments of his life would be depicted, including personally approving Angela Bassett to play his mother, Catherine. That level of involvement mattered enormously, because by 1992, almost every public image of Michael Jackson was already being filtered through sensationalism, parody, or pure speculation. Michael's own preference for mystique, his reluctance to explain himself publicly, had left a vacuum that tabloids were more than happy to fill with whatever story sold the most papers. An American Dream offered something rare in that environment, an attempt to present Michael Jackson as an actual human being shaped by an extraordinary and extraordinarily strange life. The timing of the project wasn't an accident either. By 1992, the Jackson family occupied a strange, increasingly fractured place in the public imagination. Michael was still, technically, the biggest entertainer on the planet, riding the success of Dangerous and its world tour. His sister Janet had become one of the highest paid and most successful female artists alive in her own right, but despite all of that success, public perception of the family as a whole had shifted hard away from the warmth people associated with the original Jackson 5 years. Michael had gone nearly a decade without giving many interviews. His changing physical appearance and growing isolation had turned him into a permanent subject of tabloid fascination. Stories about cosmetic surgery, his changing skin color, eccentric behavior, and emotional instability increasingly overshadowed coverage of his actual music. Meanwhile, the family's image was fraying in public too. LaToya Jackson had broken away entirely, posed for Playboy, and made allegations of abuse against Joseph Jackson, reigniting scrutiny over the family's private life. Ironically, the miniseries' own producer, Jermaine Jackson, had contributed to that same fracturing image just a year earlier, releasing a diss track aimed at Michael that accused him of turning his back on his family and his race. By 1992, in other words, the Jacksons were no longer the aspirational American musical family the country had embraced in the 1970s. Increasingly, they were being perceived as fractured, controlling, emotionally damaged, and consumed by their own fame. Seen against that backdrop, An American Dream looks less like simple entertainment and more like a carefully timed attempt to reclaim the family's story before somebody else did it for them. The miniseries deliberately pulls the audience back to Gary, Indiana, the cramped house, the shared bunk beds, the rehearsals, the poverty, the discipline, reframing the Jacksons not as untouchable superstars but as a hardworking Black American family whose success came from sacrifice and talent, not luck. Even the title itself does that work. An American Dream positions the family as a symbol of ambition and survival, not the bizarre tabloid caricature they'd increasingly become. Commercially, it worked. The second night alone drew more than 38 million viewers, making it the highest-rated program of its week and one of the most successful music biography productions of the entire decade. It picked up 4 Emmy nominations, with choreographer Michael Peters winning for his work on the series. Critically, though, the reception was more mixed. Reviewers generally praised the performances, especially Angela Bassett as Catherine and Lawrence Hilton Jacobs as Joseph, with Bassett in particular giving the series real emotional weight. But the criticism that followed the project wasn't that it was poorly made. It was that it was too carefully controlled. Variety called it somewhat bland in its first half, though it still credited the series as a commendable effort at approximating the truth. Entertainment Weekly was harsher, giving it a C+, and arguing the show bent Michael Jackson's life into the shape of a celebratory TV movie. To the production's credit, it didn't avoid everything uncomfortable. It touched on the long-reported accounts of Joseph Jackson's abuse, on the pressure and emotional cost the family paid for their success. But it always did so within the safe boundaries network television allowed at the time. That selectivity is most obvious in how the series ends, with the victory tour framed as a triumphant family reunion, with barely a hint of the explosive tension, internal power struggles, and lasting resentment that tour actually created between Michael and his brothers. By stopping at that emotional high point, the series sidesteps the darker chapters that were already becoming public knowledge by 1992. The controversies, the public feuding, Michael's rapidly changing appearance, his growing distance from the family structure that had once defined him entirely. What you're left with is a production that's genuinely emotional, polished, and often powerful, but also deeply selective in what it was willing to show. It revealed real pain behind the family's success, but only within the limits of what the Jacksons themselves were comfortable putting on television. That tension is exactly what makes it fascinating today. It's simultaneously an honest window into the family and a carefully managed piece of image control, made at a pivotal moment in their history. Man in the Mirror, the Michael Jackson story, arrived on VH1 in August 2004, just months before Michael was due to stand trial on child molestation charges. Directed by Alan Moyle and starring Flex Alexander in the lead role, it functioned almost like an unofficial sequel to An American Dream, picking up more or less where that series had ended, at the Victory Tour's emotional high point, and carrying the story forward into everything the earlier miniseries had left out: solo superstardom, isolation, plastic surgery, Neverland, marriages, children, and the allegations that were about to define the rest of his life. But unlike An American Dream, this was not a family-sanctioned production. Michael Jackson and the Jackson family had no meaningful involvement in it, and because the film was unauthorized, it was missing one of the most essential ingredients any Michael Jackson story needs: the music. None of his original songs were licensed for the film, which left the entire project feeling strangely hollow, like a Michael Jackson story with the actual Michael Jackson subtracted out of it. The timing wasn't subtle. By the early 2000s, Michael was once again one of the most talked-about people on television, but almost entirely for reasons that had nothing to do with music: bizarre public behavior, fallouts with his record label, erratic conduct, rumors of financial collapse, and a changing appearance that fueled endless plastic surgery speculation. Martin Bashir's documentary, Living with Michael Jackson, had aired the year before and become a massive ratings event on both sides of the Atlantic, reigniting scrutiny over Michael's relationships with children, his parenting choices, and his life at Neverland. His own rebuttal special drew huge numbers too, proving Michael Jackson could still pull an audience even, especially when the coverage was damaging. In that context, Man in the Mirror feels less like a considered biographical drama and more like an attempt to cash in on public fascination at one of the lowest, most vulnerable points of Michael's entire life. By August 2004, he wasn't just a controversial celebrity anymore. He was a man awaiting a criminal trial that, had it ended in conviction, would have permanently defined the rest of his story. The film tries to humanize him, portraying him as damaged, lonely, childlike, and shaped by trauma. But in doing that, it flattens him into something closer to a one-dimensional figure, naive, emotionally stunted, easily manipulated. Instead of capturing the actual contradiction that made Michael Jackson so compelling, the genius, the strategist, the businessman, the perfectionist, and the deeply wounded man, all in the same body, it leans hard into the familiar tabloid shorthand. The plastic surgery, the oxygen chamber mythology, Neverland, Elizabeth Taylor, Lisa Marie Presley, the masks, the sense of a superstar losing his grip on reality. That's really what the criticism came down to. Reviewers didn't just object to the film being critical of Michael, they objected to how thin, cheap, and exploitative it felt. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer called it a tastelessly timed attempt to milk sympathy out of Michael's legal situation. Pop Matters pointed out that VH1 aired it as part of a wider Michael Jackson programming block that also included reruns of An American Dream and the Bashir documentary, treating his life less like a story and more like ratings inventory. Flex Alexander's performance became one of the most criticized elements of the whole production. The issue wasn't just that he didn't physically resemble Michael Jackson, it's that the makeup, voice work, and overall characterization pushed the portrayal toward caricature rather than performance. Even sympathetic viewers found it distracting, because Michael's face, voice, and physical mannerisms were so specific and so recognizable that a weak imitation broke the illusion almost instantly. The reception, overall, was poor. The film sits with a very low audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, and compared to the massive cultural footprint of An American Dream or the ratings of Bashir's documentary, Man in the Mirror never came close to becoming a respected or defining screen portrayal of Michael Jackson. Perhaps the clearest sign of just how disconnected the film was from the real Jackson family came in Michael's own response to it. Shortly after it aired, he released a strongly worded statement condemning what he saw as a betrayal and accusing the media more broadly of continually humiliating and misrepresenting both him and his family. Because of the gag order tied to his upcoming trial, he actually had to seek a judge's permission before saying anything publicly at all, which makes the statement itself notable. Rather than address the legal case directly, Michael focused on years of media distortion, saying plainly that the film in no way represented who his family actually was, and pointing to decades of tabloid caricature, including the Wacko Jacko label he'd spent years trying to shed. What that response reveals is exactly why the film never landed the way An American Dream had. An American Dream was selective and carefully managed, sure, but it still felt emotionally honest, because the family themselves were shaping it. Man in the Mirror, by contrast, feels like an outsider reconstructing Michael Jackson purely through the lens of scandal-era media coverage, without his music, without his creative input, without any grounding from the people who actually knew him. In Michael's own eyes, it was just another example of the entertainment industry profiting off a distorted fascination with his downfall, instead of trying to understand the actual human being underneath the headlines. Searching for Neverland arrived in 2017, the third major dramatized attempt at Michael Jackson's life story, but it landed in a completely different cultural climate than either of the projects before it. Made nearly 8 years after Michael's death, it emerged during a period when public perception of him had shifted again, and dramatically. Following his passing in 2009, Michael experienced one of the most extraordinary posthumous career resurgences in entertainment history. His music shot back up the charts worldwide, documentaries and tribute specials dominated television, This Is It became a massive box office success, and a younger generation started rediscovering him less as the controversial figure of the 2000s, and more as a tragic, isolated genius consumed by the weight of his own fame. Death softened a lot of the hostility and ridicule that had defined his final public years, replacing it with fascination, sympathy, and nostalgia. In many ways, Searching for Neverland feels like a direct reaction against the tone of Man in the Mirror. Where the 2004 film leaned hard into tabloid spectacle and caricature, this one tries to move inward, portraying Michael not primarily as a bizarre media figure, but as a vulnerable, deeply lonely man trying to navigate the collapse of his career, his finances, and his emotional stability in the years after his 2005 trial. Ironically, the film picks up almost exactly where Man in the Mirror left off, focusing specifically on the period after Michael's acquittal, when he largely withdrew from public life and lived an increasingly transient, isolated existence away from Neverland. That period matters because it became one of the most mythologized and speculated about stretches of his entire life. After the trial, Michael essentially vanished from public view for long stretches, moving between Bahrain, Ireland, Las Vegas, and a series of rented homes in Los Angeles, while rumors about his finances, his health, his relationship with his children, and his mental state swirled endlessly in the press. After his death, there was suddenly enormous public appetite to understand what those final years had actually looked like, behind closed doors. Searching for Neverland was clearly built to answer that question, presenting a more intimate portrait of Michael not as a performer, but as a father, an employer, a friend, and an emotionally exhausted man trying to survive the fallout of global humiliation. The film was based on the book Remember the Time, Protecting Michael Jackson in His Final Days, written by two of Michael's former bodyguards, Bill Whitfield and Javon Beard, which immediately gave the project a sense of authenticity that Man in the Mirror had never managed. Rather than being built around tabloid headlines and speculation, it was rooted in first-hand accounts from people who had actually lived alongside Michael during those final years. And even though the Jackson family didn't officially approve or cooperate with the production, having people from Michael's real inner circle attached gave it a degree of credibility the earlier VH1 film simply never had. Casting mattered here too, and in a different way than before. Instead of hiring a conventional actor to attempt a broad impersonation, the production cast Navi, a Michael Jackson impersonator who had actually known Michael personally and performed for him during his lifetime. That choice gave the portrayal a noticeably different texture than Flex Alexander's version. Navi obviously couldn't fully replicate Michael Jackson, but his understanding of Michael's voice, body language, and emotional fragility made the performance feel restrained and human rather than exaggerated. The film consciously avoids turning Michael into a parody, instead portraying him as soft-spoken, anxious, childlike, emotionally dependent, and deeply afraid of betrayal and exposure. Even so, the reviews were mixed. Critics generally agreed the film was more sympathetic and less exploitative than what came before it, but many also felt it lacked real dramatic tension and leaned toward an overly sanitized version of Michael's story, bordering, in the eyes of some reviewers, on hagiography. Michael comes across almost entirely as a misunderstood victim, without much deeper interrogation of the controversies and contradictions that continued to surround him. Others criticized the low-budget television production values and uneven supporting performances, though most still considered it a far more respectful and emotionally believable portrayal than Man in the Mirror had been. What makes Searching for Neverland culturally interesting is how clearly it reflects the broader rehabilitation of Michael Jackson's public image in the years after his death. By 2017, the dominant conversation around him had shifted away from scandal and ridicule and toward tragedy, exploitation, loneliness, and the psychological toll of a lifetime spent inside the fame machine. The film sits squarely inside that shift. It doesn't mythologize his superstardom the way An American Dream did, and it doesn't sensationalize his collapse the way Man in the Mirror did. It tries, instead, to present him as a vulnerable, emotionally worn-down man searching for something like peace in the final chapter of his life, because by that point, the spectacle of Michael Jackson had already been documented endlessly. What remained genuinely mysterious and commercially compelling was the man hiding behind the image that had been built around him. Michael, released in 2026, is the most ambitious and commercially significant attempt yet to put Michael Jackson's life on screen. For the first time, his story was finally given the scale to match the size of his actual life, transformed into something genuinely cinematic rather than another made-for-TV drama. Directed by Antoine Fuqua and produced by Graham King, the Academy Award-winning producer behind Bohemian Rhapsody, the film was developed with the full cooperation of Michael's estate and with the direct involvement of several members of the Jackson family. That cooperation unlocked something none of the earlier projects ever had: full access to Michael's actual music catalog, with the film built around his original recordings and elaborate recreations of his most iconic performances, staged at a scale no previous Jackson biopic had ever attempted. That single fact separated it instantly from Man in the Mirror and Searching for Neverland, both of which struggled without the built-in gravitas that Michael's actual music carries in the public imagination. In a lot of ways, Michael was conceived as the definitive cinematic statement on his life, the Jackson equivalent of blockbuster music biopics like Elvis, Rocket Man, and Bohemian Rhapsody itself. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, music biopics had become one of Hollywood's most reliably profitable genres, capable of generating massive box office numbers while simultaneously reigniting streaming activity and catalog sales for legacy artists. The Michael Jackson estate clearly understood that few artists in history carried more untapped cinematic potential than Michael did. His life already contained every element of a Hollywood epic: childhood stardom, family pressure, breaking racial barriers, unprecedented global fame, genuine creative genius, isolation, scandal, and tragedy. But the timing of the project carried real weight too. It was officially announced only months after leaving Neverland, the explosive HBO documentary that reignited allegations of child sexual abuse against Michael and dramatically shifted public conversation around his legacy. Before that documentary, much of the scrutiny surrounding the allegations had actually softened in the years since his death. Public memory had increasingly centered on his artistry and the tragedy of his life, rather than the controversies that consumed his final years. Leaving Neverland disrupted that rehabilitation almost overnight, forcing the allegations back into mainstream conversation in a way the culture hadn't seen since the early 2000s. Against that backdrop, Michael was controversial before a single frame was shot. Critics immediately questioned whether a fully estate-approved biopic could ever be objective, arguing the project risked becoming little more than sanitized legacy management, timed to rehabilitate Michael's image in the wake of renewed scrutiny. The estate and filmmakers pushed back hard against that framing, repeatedly emphasizing in early statements that the film wouldn't be a puff piece, but an honest portrayal of Michael's contradictions and struggles. There were even early suggestions the film intended to address the allegations directly, as part of telling the whole story. But as production moved forward, it became increasingly clear the film would avoid dramatizing or seriously interrogating the accusations against Michael in any substantive way, reportedly restricted as much by the legal realities surrounding the estate as by any creative decision. One of the clearest signals of genuine family support came through casting. Jafar Jackson, Jermaine Jackson's son and Michael's real-life nephew, was cast in the lead role itself. That decision became one of the film's biggest selling points, and arguably its strongest source of emotional authenticity in the eyes of audiences. Unlike every previous portrayal, which relied entirely on impersonation, Michael could market itself around the idea that someone biologically connected to Michael Jackson was now embodying him on screen. The physical resemblance, vocal tone, and movement became a major talking point almost immediately. In a story so heavily shaped by disputes over ownership and interpretation, Jaafar's casting functioned almost like a seal of legitimacy, a visible signal that at least part of the family was standing behind this version of the story. Not everyone stood behind it, though. Randy and Janet Jackson were reportedly unsupportive of the project and declined to have their likenesses portrayed on screen. Paris Jackson, Michael's daughter, had publicly expressed discomfort in previous years over how the estate managed aspects of her father's image and legacy, and while she never positioned herself directly against the film, there was a lingering sense in her public comments that no Hollywood production, however well-intentioned, could ever fully capture who her father actually was as a human being and as a parent. That tension reinforces the question sitting underneath the entire project. Who actually gets to control the story of Michael Jackson? The family, the estate, the media, or, ultimately, the audience itself? Structurally, Michael ends up resembling an American dream far more than its marketing initially suggested. Even though it's framed as an intimate portrait of Michael himself, much of its emotional core revolves around family dynamics. Specifically, Michael's struggle to separate himself, creatively and psychologically, from the Jackson family machine as he tries to emerge as his own artist. His relationship with Joseph Jackson is central once again, largely continuing the familiar portrayal of Joseph as a domineering patriarch whose abuse and pressure shaped both Michael's trauma and his perfectionism. Critics argued the film, much like An American Dream before it, simplifies a lot of the deeper dysfunction within the family. The sibling rivalries, the enabling, the financial dependency, the resentment toward Michael's fame, falling back instead on a clearer hero versus patriarch dynamic that's simply easier for mainstream audiences to process emotionally. That's been the core criticism trailing the film through its entire release, that Michael was ultimately built more for the fans than for the full truth. Critics argue it presents the version of Michael Jackson audiences want to believe in, the tortured genius, the misunderstood artist, the self-sacrificing family man, while smoothing over the darker contradictions and unresolved controversies that still surround his life. And yet, despite all of that, audiences responded to it in overwhelming numbers. Critical reviews were mixed to negative, with plenty of accusations of whitewashing. Fans, on the other hand, embraced it completely, turning out globally not just to watch a movie, but to participate in something bigger, a shared cultural event built around Michael's music, image, and legacy. In an era where media consumption has become increasingly fragmented across streaming platforms and short-form content, Michael pulled off something genuinely rare. It brought different generations together in physical theaters, driven by a shared emotional connection to the music. Social media flooded with dance recreations and renewed fascination with his artistry, as older audiences who'd lived through his fame sat next to younger viewers who'd only discovered him through viral clips and trending playlists. For the estate, the impact was almost impossible to overstate. Whatever criticism the film drew for how it handled controversy, it succeeded completely at the thing it actually set out to do, reigniting Michael Jackson as a living cultural force for an entirely new generation. In the week following its release, Michael's streaming numbers hit some of the highest levels of his entire career, and the estate pulled off something no other artist's team has managed, simultaneously holding the world's #1 movie and the world's #1 streaming song at the same time. As the film pushed toward $1 billion at the box office, plans for a sequel were already moving forward. More than 16 years after his death, Michael proved something few artists in modern history can still claim: the ability to create a genuine global cultural moment, capable of uniting audiences through nostalgia, spectacle, music, and collective memory all at once. Step back and look at all 4 projects side by side, and a clear pattern emerges. An American Dream wasn't really about accuracy, it was about the family reclaiming their narrative at a moment their public image was falling apart. Man in the Mirror wasn't really about understanding Michael, it was about capitalizing on his downfall at the worst possible moment of his life. Searching for Neverland wasn't really a neutral biography either. It was the culture's attempt to soften a man it had already ridiculed to death, literally, by giving him back his humanity a few years too late. And Michael isn't simply a celebration of his artistry, it's a $1 billion legacy management project, timed deliberately against renewed allegations, designed to make sure the story the world remembers is the one the estate wants told. None of these 4 films were ever just biography. Each one was built by a different set of hands, for a different audience, serving a different agenda, and each one tells you as much about the moment it was made as it does about the man at its center. Michael Jackson's story stopped being simple biography a long time ago. It became mythology, rewritten again and again, depending on who was allowed to hold the pen. If you want more deep dives into how Hollywood builds, breaks, and rebuilds the legends of pop culture's biggest icons, subscribe, because this is only one chapter of a much bigger story.